Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and in this video, we're going to be looking at a cool new feature in SQL Server called Resource Governor. So jumping into an overview, Resource Governor is going to allow us to manage our resources. So we'll get into managing resource utilization. We're going to look at grouping resources. What do I mean by that? We'll look at resource pools, and we'll actually visit that topic twice. First, more conceptually, and then later on we'll walk through some of the more specifics of resource pools. We'll look at the security surrounding Resource Governor. Classification functions. They are a key part of using Resource Governor. So we'll talk about classification and classification functions. And then we'll get into actually creating our resource pools and our workload groups for grouping the workloads under our SQL Server instance. But starting with managing resource utilization, one thing you can be sure of as a DBA, the demand for your database services will continue to increase. And I don't just mean personally, but also on your server that you're managing. The amount of utilization tends to go up over time and almost never down. So you're almost always on a path towards disaster as a DBA, a path toward running out of resources to service the various clients in your environment. And it's interesting that the best DBAs typically may go unnoticed because until something goes wrong, no one really notices. When it crashes, then everyone knows your number, right? Well, you can manage runaway processes and you can manage login priorities using Resource Governor. And those are two of the things we want to look at. Let's say in your environment you've got various applications running. Typically, you can group those applications into categories. It's those categories that we're going to assign priorities to when we use Resource Governor. So for example, let's start looking at classification. I've got some client applications here on the left, and on the right I've got my logical representation of an SQL Server instance. And let's say we've got applications that are doing things related to management reporting or production applications or ad hoc queries or administrative activities. So something comes in from my client. Well, I need to take those requests and assign them to specific categories using classification. I need to classify them. Once I classify them, I can then turn around and better manage them. Once I've classified them, it's those classifications that I'm going to then assign to various pools of resources or resource pools. So logically, I have not just one SQL Server instance, but possibly three, or it depends on how many groupings you create, where it's a subset of the total resources available in the server. Now, those resource pools do not need to total to 100. That's not quite the way it works. Any one of those can utilize 100% of your resources. Problem is, they both can't utilize 100% at the same time, right? So what you're actually doing is not so much divvying up the resources into finite groups. You're setting a ceiling as to how much of the total resources will be available to any particular pool. We will need to create a function specifically for classifying our SQL requests. You can create a function to classify your requests based on various different criteria, such as the login, which database they're going against, the host name, what application are they running. You can even classify requests based on the geographic location or perhaps an IP address. So looking at the create function for creating a classifier function, it's the standard create function you're going to find under SQL Server using T-SQL. So it's simply create function followed by a schema name, owner name, followed by the unique specific name for this classifier function, and then return sysname with schema binding as a required statement for creating a classifier function. But then I get into the specifics of my function. When you move down to the select case, I have suser_s_name. Now this is the function I'm using in this particular case because this classifier function is going to classify incoming requests based on the user ID, the username. What did you log in as? So if you logged in as production proc or reporting proc, you'll be production proc associated with high priority group, reporting associated with a mid-priority group. And those groups are going to be defined elsewhere. But this is just to do the classification. And if you don't fall into either one of those two, you're automatically put into a low priority group, which is a third classification or a third group that we're going to create separately. But here, let's jump over to our server and actually create our classifier function. So we want to go through creating a classifier function and using resource governor. But the first thing we need to do as far as resource governor is concerned is create a classifier function. Now, I said as far as resource governor is concerned. Now, there are some things that I want to set up even before, or you should set up even before you go into creating your classifier function. Now, oftentimes with security, and I would even say I'd recommend with your security, you're using groups as much as possible. I'm using Windows Authentication. I'm logged in with a new account I created called Carl. And Carl is part of a group, a Windows group I created. I'm going to go over to my domain controller. So here I am on my domain controller. And if I bring up my administrative tools, go to users and groups, I've created a new user and a new group. The new user is Carl, but I've added Carl to this group, SQL Server Admins, just a generic Windows group. If I double click on that, I can see its members includes Carl, and Carl is just a local user that I added to that group, right? So Windows basic stuff. And now over on my, go ahead and close that down. And now back over on my SQL Server box, I've logged in as Carl. If I go ahead and start SQL Server Management Studio, let's go ahead and create our function. So I'm logging in here using that Windows Authentication account. Tell it I want a new query window. And we're just going to type this one up. It's pretty simple coding. So this is something I want to add to my master database. Your classifier function goes into your master database. Use the create function statement. User classifier is what I'm calling my function. You can call it anything you want. This is your function you're creating. And the standard syntax for creating a function. And this is not a SQL Server developer course, so I'm not going to get into as much detail with creating functions and things of that nature. That's a topic by far in of itself. So I'm just going to give you a function that you could probably easily reuse to do a simple example of this. As begins, return, and then select case. And I'm going to use a built-in function in SQL Server that'll give me the current user, or in this case, the current group that the user is a member of. So using the isMember, turns pink, so I got it right. Now I need to give it the fully qualified name, which is Mel's domain, and then the name of that Windows group, which is SQL Server Admins. Closing paren. And now the two different cases. One, when it is 1, if you don't know this function, you will in a second, then I'm going to put you into a high priority group. Why is it the value 1? That's just the way this function works. Here, let me close this down so you can see a little better. This function isMember simply returns 1 if this is true, that I am currently running under an account that is a member of this group, and returns 0 if I'm running under an account that's not a member of that group. Then I'll get a 0. And if it's something else, I'll just go to my default for resource governor. That's the end of my select case. The end of my function. And then give it a go. Now, a little more on this. That's my group, right? This is my SQL Server group that I'm using. If I go to security, under logins, I've added SQL Server admins to SQL Server. Carl is not in here. Carl only has access because he's part of this group. And once again, that's a basic administrative thing you want to follow under Windows and under SQL. You want to typically try and manage groups as opposed to individual users. So I only added this domain group to SQL Server, and then any user I add to that group has that access. whatever access is given to this group. So here I'm simply checking to see if the current user that I'm running under is a member of that group. Now if I wanted to, I could test for specific users, but let's say you've got several SQL admins and they should all be running at the same priority. That's a lot of maintenance. You don't want to have to maintain this function. You should be able to write it once and let it set, right? So by using a group name, you can add and remove people to the group and your function stays the same. Let's go ahead and run our function. Command completed successfully. If I go over to System Databases, go to my master database, under Programmability, Functions, Scalar Valued, and there I have added my user classifier function. So I'm good to go on that. Next, I need to add my workload group and my resource pool and have them use this function. A few things to note when we're talking about the security associated with Resource Governor. First of all, typically you'll want to be a member of the sysadmin role. That will give you specifically control server permission. Control server permission is required to change the configuration of Resource Governor, but you don't have to go to that lower level of assigning permissions. Simply adding a user to the sysadmin role will give them control server permission. And then the other thing is, if you want to view the active configuration, a user has to have view server state permission. Once again, there's a built-in server role that will give them that. It's the server admin role. So simply adding a user to the server admin role will allow them to view the server state permission. If you want to enable Resource Governor, it's simply Alter Resource Governor Reconfigure. And to disable it, it's simply Alter Resource Governor Disable. Both of those statements will require that you are either a member of the sysadmin role or at least been given control server permission. Looking at resource pools again, resource pools are simply subsets of your total system resources. Pools of your system resources are defined, and then a percentage of those resources is allocated to a pool. So by default, you really just have one pool that has 100% of your CPU and 100% of your RAM allocated to it. But with Resource Governor, we're going to create additional pools. We can create a second pool or a third pool, where the second pool can only utilize up to 10% of the CPU and 10% of the RAM, versus the third pool, that one has been set to only use no more than 50% of the system resources. Now those two numbers don't have to be the same. Just in this example, I did 50% of CPU and 50% of RAM. It could have been 35% of one and 25% of another. A couple other things to note. These are used to minimize the effects of runaway processes. So if a process is running in pool 1, it's a runaway process, it can actually eat up all of the available system resources. And I'm only talking about CPU and RAM right now. However, if that same process were assigned to pool 2 or 3, it would be capped or limited in how much of your system resources it could utilize, therefore allowing other processes to continue to run. So resource pools allow us to group system resources and access levels, and presently the only two resources you can manage with Resource Governor are CPU time and memory. How do you go about creating a resource pool? It's the create resource pool statement. So create resource pool followed by the specific name of your pool. And then you're going to give it information such as what is the minimum CPU, maximum CPU, what's the minimum memory or the maximum memory. In our cases, we're going to set ours to about 50%, but these are some of the options you can set with the resource pool statement. Before we actually do that though, let's talk a little bit about workload groups. Your workload groups serve as containers for processes running against the database. Now these containers or groups are mapped to specific resource pools. So going back to my SQL Server instance, let's say I have a production applications category and a reporting category or subgroup, an administration activities subgroup, and an ad hoc queries subgroup. Each one of these could be a separate workload group. So let's jump over to our server and create a resource pool and our workload group. So moving into creating my resource pool, simply create resource pool, give it a descriptive name, and since we are looking at managing administrative functions, I'll call it admin functions. And now the 4 parameters I need to set are for the 2 resources that can be managed. I'm going to set a minimum and a maximum for my CPU and my memory. So starting off with the minimum for the CPU, min underscore CPU underscore %, and I'm just going to set that to the bare minimum of a 0. But my maximum, that's the one I'm going to cap by setting that to a value of 50. So max underscore CPU underscore % again. Set that to 50, give it a comma. Now I'll do the same thing with my memory. The minimum, don't care so much about that. I'll let that be 0. But the maximum, that's what I care about. I'm going to set that again to 50. Memory underscore % equals 50. Close out that segment. And I'm not going to run that yet. I'm going to run both of these at the same time. Make sure I'm using my master here. These all go in the master DB. So my resource pool, that's my create statement for that. And then the other thing, I need to create my 2 workload groups. So create workload group, and then the same names used in my function, which were high priority group with an importance for this group. I'm going to set this one to importance of high. It's my high priority group. And then I tell it what pool to use. I manually associate it with the pool by simply saying using and then the name of my resource pool. Give that a go. Now there's my high. I also need a low. We also created a low priority one, and I'm going to take the economical way and copy and paste that. So we just need to make 2 minor changes. Change importance to low and change the beginning of the name to low to match the function we created. With that, that will create my resource pool. It will create my 2 workload groups. And then one last thing, there's an alter statement I'll want to run to activate resource governor and also tell it to use the classifier function. So using the alter statement, alter resource governor with, give it the name of a classifier function. And mine is simply dbo.user classifier. Prints match. And then I finally need my alter resource governor reconfigure statement. With all that in place, F5, commands completed successfully. I actually typed all of that syntactically right the first time through. So we want to go over here to management. We can double check, see what we did. By the way, with the workload group function, I only set 1 parameter, the importance parameter. You're going to see several once we get in here in the GUI version of the same thing. Expanding resource governor, expanding resource pool. I can see my resource pool, my admin functions. Expanding that, I can see the workload groups associated with it, and there are 2. Right? If I right-click on any one of those 3 and go to properties, I get the same interface, and it's the GUI for configuring the same thing we just did using T-SQL. But you'll see my values of 50% for CPU. You'll see the high and the low values here set. Everything else here, I went with the defaults. All right? And it is indeed enabled. So we're good to go. So with that, we've actually configured our resource pool. Now, anyone coming in with a user ID in that Windows group gets directed to my high priority group and gets a higher priority a higher percentage of what's available to that pool to anyone else who's in a low priority group. So looking at some vocabulary you should know, really just three main new terms. That's first of all classifier function. It's a function used to map or classify incoming requests into specific workload groups. Second, a resource pool is simply a subset of your system resources that can be made available to your applications or end users. And then we talked about a workload group, which is a mechanism for grouping your incoming database requests. Well, looking at what we covered in this video, well, first of all, we covered the basics. We talked about classification functions, resource pools, workload groups, how to create them. We talked a little bit about the security of Resource Governor, basically said sysadmin, the sysadmin role, built-in role. By adding someone to that, they have the ability to configure and turn on, turn off Resource Governor. We talked about the ability to view Resource Governor through the system administration role. But more importantly, we got into what Resource Governor will do. Resource Governor will classify your incoming connections and route their workloads to a specific group. It can also monitor resource usage for each workload in a group. It pools your resources and then sets pool-specific limits on CPU usage and memory allocation. And it can associate grouped workloads with a specific pool of resources. Last, it can identify and set priorities for work groups. So with that, we come to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.